Okay, let's get going. Welcome everyone. We still got a couple of people trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started here since we're 5 minutes past the hour. I'm Eric Dodds. I lead customer success at RudderStack. And we can tell you a little bit more about RudderStack later, but really what we want to do is talk to Max Werner, who has been a friend of RudderStack for a long time. And he has been a data engineer in multiple contexts. And the thing we're going to talk about today is how data engineers work with other teams. And there are all sorts of different structures that we see as far as data engineers and the way they interact. And even the term data engineer itself can mean different things depending on the size of the company, depending on the stack, and depending on sort of the data needs. So we're going to ask Max all about that. And I think we have an intro slide, so I'm probably jumping ahead. Do we need to?
Oh, we do. I mean, you covered it basically all there. Like, yeah. Data engineering is like it's a catch-all term for you do things with data. Which is like saying like, oh yeah, there's a car mechanic that you do things with metal. Lots of things in there.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. You want to click to the next slide, and we can do some intros since we kind of already covered that. I kind of gave you some accolades, but I'll just give a little bit of background around why we love talking with you and why I'm excited to chat with you about this subject. You've done data engineering in a bunch of different contexts. So Proposify is a startup in the B2B space, and you're currently doing some work with Warner Brothers, which is a massive company with massive amounts of data and hundreds or thousands of data pipelines. And then you also do some consulting through Obsessive Analytics, and you get to see all sorts of companies. So you've sort of lived and get to experience through consulting just a wide spectrum of different sort of ways that data engineering happens inside of companies.
Yeah, absolutely. It gets crazy at times, and we'll get into like the difference of like the startups versus the enterprise space, and there's also, of course, like different maturity stages that companies have with data. There's also, of course, a number of companies that I do consulting with that kind of, they don't have a data stack. They kind of just on the level of we're collecting some data with Google Analytics, and that's kind of it. And what do you mean you can do things with data that go beyond running a Google Analytics report? So it gets there's a lot of variety. Like you said, data engineering is almost never the same from company to company or even within the same company. Oops, double click there. Right, so different roles for data engineering. I support SMBs here. I mean, small medium businesses, but that covers startups as well. And to start off with a little thing that came across my meme list, that kind of summarizes this greatly. It says, "Dear recruiters, if you're looking for a Java, Python, PHP, React, Angular, Postgres, Redis, Mongo, AWS, and so on, that's not a full stack developer. That's an entire IT department." And if you look at job postings for data engineers or even data analysts, this is basically the same. You can, replace a couple of, things here, maybe instead of Java and Python, or it will probably say Python, but instead of Java and PHP, it might say Salesforce and those kinds of things. But generally, the breadth of the skill set that companies are generally looking for when they're hiring a data engineer is
right. I mean, it's kind of like, okay, you have expertise in SQL and can do the ops stuff to connect, to downstream tools like Marketo and Salesforce, and you can deploy pipelines on Kubernetes clusters.
Yeah, like basically you just, you can do it all, from start to finish,
Okay, we know that that's not actually reality, and sort of the keyword stuffing for engineering focused job descriptions is horrendous, and I think that's a whole other webinar topic. But so let's talk through the differences depending on stage and what skill sets do you actually need at sort of the stage of the business.
Absolutely. Right. So if we go kind of from left to right, from basically small to ever large, I mean, it comes kind of down to these like three different categories, like how specialized are you? What do your day-to-day duties include in the given job? And what are the teams that you work with? And of course, at a startup space, when there just isn't that many people, you're generally not specialized. You actually do mirror that, screenshot from before, where you kind of have to know a little bit about everything, because there is just not a dedicated, data operations person that can help you with the, Airflow DAGs or Kafka, consumers. It's just you kind of have to figure it out as you go.
And I think in a lot of those situations, at least what we've seen is someone who is a leader on the engineering team is sort of responsible for the data stack, whether that's, just because they're there and they know it needs to be done, or if that's intentional, right? Like it's just sort of shepherded by an early leader in the engineering department, whether or not they're formally a data engineer, those responsibilities roll up to them generally.
Yeah, for sure. Of course, that's exactly it, right? It depends. Like in some startups, you have that engineer that is slightly data leaning, or maybe it's even like the CTO that kind of does it in his spare time, or if you come in and you have a little bit of that server background, then you can do it as the engineer. Like it varies wildly. So yeah, like your duties are everything, right? Or some of those things, depending on how small the startup is. And naturally, that means the teams that you work with is all of them, right? You're going to have to talk to the engineers to help you with the stack, like more so the DevOps side of things there. You have to talk to the engineers to get analytics code implemented, usually inside the application. I've seen very few instances where data engineers actually touch the main, product code. So be it a web app, a mobile app, a website, or whatever. The data engineers often don't interact with that code base directly. Usually because they're not trusted, but it's a different kind of programming. But it helps to have that skill set a little bit, kind of like if you know enough about, let's say your startup has a mobile app, and you know enough about how mobile apps work and life cycle stages for Android and iOS apps and these kinds of things, that you can communicate more directly with the engineers that actually build the app. That's great.
Sure.
Yeah. As we kind of mature a little bit and we get into the small medium business stage, you will naturally specialize more. And also, of course, that means the job postings for data engineers will be more specialized. So if there actually maybe starts to be a data team, right? You're not just have the jack of all trades. You have someone who's more focused on the pipelines. Someone maybe that's more focused on maybe even like some analysis, or someone that's even directly just specialized on, like, you make sure that Salesforce works from the data perspective.
Yep.
Which means that,
question for you on the SMB. So I think the startup is fairly straightforward in terms of you generally have someone from engineering who's kind of doing a little bit of everything. On the other end, we'll talk about enterprise. That's a little bit more straightforward just because the roles become more defined. But in this SMB space, there tends to be, and I'm interested in your perspective on this because I know you have done a lot of work sort of in the marketing ops type space as a data engineer. And one thing that we see that's kind of interesting, marketing tends to be the tip of the spear when it comes to data, right? Which makes sense. I mean, they need a lot of data to optimize what they're doing, to understand what's going on. The top of the funnel tends to produce a lot of data, right? You're driving a ton of traffic, and then downstream data, sort of subsets of that by conversion rate. And so in the SMB space, what do you see around sort of there's roles that can blend in different directions? So if someone from engineering has been leading the charge, generally you sort of move into like a more formal data engineering role that is working closely with marketing. But it's also the case when someone from marketing ops who doesn't really have an engineering skill set kind of bleeds into the data engineering role and becomes increasingly technical. Do you see any patterns around that? Is there, sort of benefits or drawbacks to either approach? I mean, it's not something that you can control, but it's something that we see pretty often.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've seen it more often on the marketer that becomes more technical side of things rather than the engineer that slides more into the data side of things. Um, just because most startups have a hard enough time to get like the really like the good the qualified engineers already, so they want to keep them focused on like building the main product. So it's more often my experience the case that the marketers just lots of times out of necessity become more technical,
Sure.
and it almost never backfires because like a marketer already has that goal-oriented mindset, right? And like usually with these like data types of things, having a goal and working your way backwards of how you get to that goal works out a lot better than just like throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, super interesting. And I think we'll just continue to see, I think, the blending of data engineering and sort of fill in the blank ops, whether it's sales ops or marketing ops, depending on the business, because the ops roles are just having to become more technical, as opposed to being really good at configuring a single like SaaS tool, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like as we try to scale more and like do more things with fewer people or be more efficient, like at some point you need to be able to talk to the marketer in terms of Salesforce objects and fields rather than saying like this is your like workflow that you click together. And so you certainly need to be able to talk with them on a more technical level to really understand what their requirements are.
Sure, sure. One other thing I would say in the SMB space, and then I want to move on to talking about enterprise, and there's lots more good stuff, but just I think a lot of companies find themselves in this space, and this is where the lines are blurred the most, is leveraging a data warehouse to do a lot of data engineering type work, right? So in the startup world, you may not be, and it really, in many cases, doesn't necessarily make sense early on to be really warehouse heavy in terms of moving data around, A, because you don't have that much data, and B, because a lot of times you'll maybe just replicate your production database from the app, and that has basically all of your data points, and you can sort of use that as a common thing we've seen with early stage companies, right? You don't need to provision an entirely separate warehouse for analytics. You can sort of if you're running Postgres, you can replicate Postgres and sort of get the data where you need to go, and probably doing a lot of just initial manual querying to figure out what's going on. But as you get into SMB space, you start to adopt the warehouse, analytics needs grow. You're adding additional pipelines, right? So you sort of get into the ETL space and you're starting to pull data in from SaaS applications and join it. And I think when you get into managing those types of pipelines, you have to have some level of engineering skill set in order to make everything work, because it just crosses so many technical components in the stack.
Yeah, for sure. Like you said, like as you grow more, like you move more to the like having a separate database, data warehouse, depending on your size for for the data people, just because production like transactional databases tend to only reflect like the current state of the user or a thing inside the product, because that's what the app needs in order to serve the user what they're looking for, right? It's like if it's if you work on a document inside an app or something, like you only need that current state. Whereas like then the data people get more interested into like, that event stream data that is, well, how did you get there? What actions did you take? And you can't query that from that production database anymore.
Yep, absolutely. All right, I am done with my rant on SMBs. Let's talk about enterprise and then move on.
Yeah, sure. Enterprise. I mean, obviously, like an enterprise with that, I mean, when you have like a company that has thousands of employees and like a large amount of dedicated and very specialized people. I mean, just for an example here on the Werner side of things, the analytics group that I work with has at this point over 100 people whose focus is to varying degrees of specialization, data. So, that's not the people that make the games or the movies or whatever. That's literally just 100 data nerds bunched together.
That is larger than a lot of companies.
Yes, it is. So of course, at that point, your specialization becomes very, very focused, right? You don't need to have an idea of how CRMs work and data modeling works and data pipelines work, because there's dedicated teams for that. We actually they have a dedicated CRM team, that is focused only on that. So you naturally become very specialized, and that also to a certain degree will then reflect, like job postings and that kind of stuff, where you don't have that laundry list anymore, but rather, we're looking for someone to help out in this specific area. Which is why, like, the duties I have here, pick one and have you still need to have an idea of what the other workspaces include, just because it helps you talk with these teams on their level. If you have no idea what airflow does, if you have to talk to like specific pipeline people that all they talk about is airflow decks, that makes your job more difficult. You don't need to be able to run it or maintain it by any stretch, but just having an idea of what it is and how it roughly works will help a lot.
Yep.
And actually, also that means like you only work in your own team most often, where like there's specific points of context or stakeholders that might get pulled in. But for the most part, if you join the pipeline team, you're working with other people on pipelines and not much else.
Yep. Makes sense.
Yeah, so that would cover kind of the the size comparison of startups to enterprise, and how specialized those are. But now we can talk a bit more about what those specializations and like data archetypes, because you said there's lots of people that are just called data engineers, but they all do different kinds of things. So,
I love the names you came up with these. So for everyone listening, these are great, and I think this will resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there's three for actual engineering. Generally, if you go to the startup space, there's a couple of other ones as well. But for actual like data engineering types, you have what I call like the wrangler, plumber, and planner, right? Because in the end, you have to, on the wrangler side, that's the person that's usually the more expert in the analytics tool, the Salesforce, the CRM, or what have you, that knows that tool inside out and is kind of responsible for making sure that whatever data the users of those systems need gets there. Like somebody wants to target a campaign on some user data behavior, like the wrangler would be the one querying the warehouse, building the dbt model for and synthesizing that like data trades for users to get into that system.
Yep.
Once like under the degree of like technical like specialization, this would be more on the lowest end, because for the gross oversimplification, for the most part, this is SQL. You need to understand your warehouse, your window functions, and whatnot, and get your data out clean.
Right, you're understanding data models that come with the various sources and probably have a heavy analyst background, or in smaller companies, even sort of serving as the analyst.
Absolutely.
And maybe writing some reports. So a really good working knowledge of the data models, but in terms of actual like sort of configuration of flows, probably not getting into that as much.
Yeah, because that's more often the plumber. Right? Basically, the wrangler basically takes the clean data, hopefully clean data that is in your warehouse, be that your like your Rudder event stream data or your catalog data, if you mirror things like your CRM or ticket system or something into your warehouse to do some analysis. Like that's standardized schemas, and Wrangler like builds on top of that to give you your user profile and account profile.
Yep.
Once there's pieces missing in that chain, you get to the plumber, because if you need to get data into a tool that you don't have an API for, or a built-in like Rudder connector or what have you, well, you still like the business requirement doesn't change. If you can't dissuade them from using a specific tool because it doesn't have an integration. You need to make that happen somehow. And that's why I call it plumbing, because you really just connect things from left to right and making sure that everything flows as it should, because it smells real bad if you don't do it right.
Yeah.
So these are like the heavy, Python and Node users. Those are the people that like write Airflow DAGs or Lambda functions or what have you. Like they build those API integrations if they have to.
Yep. One thing that I think is interesting when you think about the Wrangler and the plumber, and I'm just thinking from the RudderStack perspective here, and this may sound funny for me to say as obviously an advocate for RudderStack, but I think there's a common misconception in the industry where, sort of the like data pipeline or CDP-esque tools, the marketing promise is just use this and you just need a Wrangler at that point, right? If you use this tool, all you'll have to do is wrangle because you'll have all this clean data in the warehouse and then, you're off to the races. And the reality is, what a lot of companies are trying to do in terms of, think about driving personalization, right? Or, sort of truly building the customer 360. The reality is even for RudderStack customers, that involves tooling that's outside of the scope of what our product provides, right? I mean, you have Kafka streams running internally. You have data science pipelines that are driving models. I mean, there's all sorts of other components that deal directly with the same data. And so it is interesting. We work with a ton of plumbers because they're trying to interact with a lot of the data that our product provides. And so for companies trying to build for those advanced use cases, the promise is that it gets a lot easier, but I don't think you'll ever get away from having to have a plumber on some level. Yeah,
for sure. It's, you mentioned models, for instance, like machine learning, there is no plug and play where you just you direct your event stream, be it like Rudder or Kafka or whatever, into a black box machine learning tool, and out comes money. Like that just doesn't exist, and that won't exist, right? There has to be that plumber that helps get that set up, right?
Right. Well, Bitcoin mining is maybe as close as you can get, where you just point some tech at something and money comes out of the other end.
Yeah. True. And a plumber like that won't go away because there is a million and one tools even under the sun, and like you from the rudder side of things, like you can't build a connector, be it like a destination connector, for every SaaS tool out there. You can't have a like a cloud extract like reverse ETL like available for every data source that someone could imagine. Because that's just not a scalable process, right? Because you have like one or two customers that might be interested in that, and you're not going to spend all the time on that.
Sure. Yeah, and even beyond connectors, and we'll move on to the planner in just a second, but one last point here. Even beyond the connectors, there are certain use cases where there's just a high level of customization. So one example that comes to mind is one of our RudderStack customers is doing personalized recommendations via Redis. And they're using a ton of the data from RudderStack. Obviously, you sort of have event stream and product views, and you can feed all of that into the, sort of the data science model, and then they're computing traits and pushing them back into Redis from warehouse actions is very cool. But the way that they sort of are implementing Redis is very specific to their company, right? And so Redis is like a great tool, but that's not an out-of-the-box plug-and-play type situation for any company, because you're sort of delivering the last mile of recommendations fed by a model. And that's really specific to how your app is built and all that sort of stuff. And so it doesn't make sense for every part of it to be 100% automated by some sort of SaaS tool where no one ever puts their hand on it.
Yeah, SAP is the like greatest example of that, right? Where you're never done implementing an SAP tool, right? Because it is, like you said, always so specific to your company, to your use case, right? And that's the plumber part. Yep. All right, planner. Sorry, I feel like I'm getting stuck on the middle column, and then like the rest of the last column. Okay, the planner. The planner. Yeah, that was with the SMBs too. So the planner. that's going to be, it's still an engineer, at heart, because you still have to have that understanding of how these pipelines work, or at least you have to have an idea of how could a data pipeline work from tool A to B. So that's why it's more like the project manager for data things. It's like the common workflow here is, you work at a company and the customer success people go, here's this great new customer success tool that we want to use. We needed to have it like integrated in our tech stack. Now you need the planner data engineer here, right? Like they are often like part of these decision-making like teams to whether or not to actually buy that tool. Because if the tool is super shiny and really useful, and like the end users, like in this case customer success, loves to use it, that's great. If you can't get the data into it that you need for those people to actually use it in a scalable fashion, it's a non-starter. It's garbage, right? You can't use it. Like, it might be working super great for other people, it just might not work for you. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, like I've been in that position quite often where like I had to just veto purchases of certain tools because that's just like it wouldn't have integrated either partially or at all.
Sure, absolutely.
It's basically the like can we do it?
Yep. We kind of call that shepherding the stack, right? You generally have someone who's kind of shepherding the stack, and they have a really good knowledge of all of the ways that things integrate, and they are a huge driver of figuring out what's actually going to work.
Yeah, because in the end, they're the ones responsible for keeping it working. So if they can't do that, they're not going to be happy.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Right, so a little detail about the Wrangler. Basically, we've talked about it before. The tools that they're using are more, tools like analytics tools, CRMs, marketing automation tools. They're the warehouse users. They most often work with those, people that really want to activate data, the marketing people, the sales people, to a certain degree, the product people that want to either drive personalization or want to have information on, do people engage with this feature that we built, right? And that's prime Wrangler space, because like you collect the information and you get it into your CRM. That's their job. I always call it like translate nerd to English, because like they most often have to take a non-technical requirement that is, I want to know how many people like use this or like did this sequence of things. And they have to translate that into, okay, what SQL query do I have to run against the warehouse, or what funnel do I have to build inside the like product analytics tools in order to get them that answer. Yep. And then that's often difficult, and it's most often the give them what they need, not what they're asking for, because often they're less technical like stakeholders like product. They often don't know what to ask for.
Yep.
Especially if you work more like traditional companies.
The translation actually kind of happens with the Wrangler. It's interesting. So for the downstream teams, they sort of give non-technical requirements and the Wrangler has to translate those. But then there are often times where the Wrangler says we actually need the plumber to provide some sort of infrastructure or feed. And so they have to translate that way as well. So it is interesting role because they translate sort of from non-technical to data, and then from data to pipeline, which is kind of interesting.
Exactly. So like, the Wrangler most often works with the plumber there, because unless it's already, a plug and play thing, and it's just, you have to pump a SQL trait somewhere, you're going to have that technical discussion of how, what's the best way to get the data from A to B. Yeah. So like, they're most often just like a purely, supportive function, very reactive, because, like, they just get told we want to do this and they have to figure out how to do that.
Yep.
All right. So speaking of the plumber, those are, like I said, a little more on the technical side. They always have their terminal open and their code editor open. They work in the cloud platform. So like your AWS, your Azure, or Google Cloud Platform, Google Cloud Compute, whatever they're calling it these days. Right, so like they know how to use those tools to get the job done.
Yep.
Of course, naturally that means the teams they work with is other data people or more heavy lifting engineers, because let's say you want to capture some information that is currently not being captured, they would also have to talk with the engineers, preferably on their level, about where in the app modifications would have to be made to allow for that data collection.
Yep.
Yeah. And again, depending on the size of the org and whatnot, they might talk to some other teams as well. But mostly it's, you know, like the fairly heavy technical people. Like I said, of course, much more technically focused, and they often have to have that business analyst skill set built in, because they get these abstract goals and they have to translate it into, you know, like, what are the technical requirements, you know, what's this going to cost us, you know, is it actually worth doing that, either there might be a direct cost in terms of licensing or just time investment for projects.
Sure.
So that comes often into there. The summary for the plumbers basically, like here, you know, figure out how to get data from A to C when that B middle part is missing.
Yeah, you know, it's I'll continue my trend of blabbering on the middle option. But one thing here I would say that we've observed a lot is that at a large organization, the sort of laid plumber's job is really complex. Because if you think about, let's just think about a simple like example pipeline. Okay, so you have, you know, maybe user events being generated in a suite of apps, you know, probably like a web app and a mobile app, and then you have pipelines in the middle, and then you have like warehouses, right? Okay, that sounds simple enough, and of course the stack is far more complex than that. But even in that scenario, you're dealing with release cycles. On mobile, you're dealing with previous versions of apps, right? So you have users that are running previous versions of apps, right? So if you have data updates, you have sort of multiple, you know, sets of data from historical stuff coming in. You have release cycles. Then on the warehouse side, you have sync schedules, right? And so at large organizations, you get into, you know, they have to have some understanding of orchestration, because you have sync cycles with different warehouses and multiple warehouses. And so it is really pretty complex, pretty challenging job.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, it's personally something that I enjoy doing, just because you're forced to learn, you know, usually new and complex tools. And, I mean, that's at least something that I enjoy doing.
Me too.
Right. Well, moving on to the planner. Yeah, familiar with all master of none. And like I said, they're more so they have to have this 1,000-foot view that is, you know, like what's our current stack. You said, like, you know, shepherding the stack, right? Because they have to know what's going on, what's flowing, and make decisions or recommendations that are, you know, like, do we integrate this or not? Can we? Does it make sense? You know, is it a bad idea? Right. So like they most often work with data teams and also external teams. So like they are the ones that work on, you know, proof of concepts with software vendors, right? You know, because like the CMO might say, here's this great marketing tool that I want to use, and then you as the planner have to go in and talk with the, you know, like the salesperson, the account manager from those tools to see whether or not that's even, you know, a realistic possibility. So you have to have like a lot more people skills in this one, but still with that data, you know, of course, focus and background and engineering background to really understand, you know, what the implications of adding or removing, you know, a piece out of that Jenga puzzle that is a data stack could mean. All right, it's fun. It's you're doing a lot less coding here, but you're doing a lot more, you know, like planning and anticipating problems, right?
Sure.
Which has a slight downside that you can often be seen as the naysayer here, because you have to be like the voice of reason that is like, this is not going to work just from the data infrastructure perspective, and we need to find something else, which is a hard conversation to have when someone is really, you know, dead set on using a specific tool, and you just have to say, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that.
Yep, makes sense.
So yeah, a lot more project management focus here than, you know, code execution or, you know, SQL modeling.
Yep. And probably found a lot more in larger organizations where you have a bigger data team.
Yeah, I mean, and that's also like usually once you grow and you have a data team and that grows, you're going to have someone that is in charge of that data team, like a data ops manager or something along those lines. And the best results that you tend to get is if that person is this planner, someone who is either done the plumbing or the wrangling before and then moved up into that management role because they understand what their team is doing and the challenges that they're facing, but they can then also help more on like the strategic side and help steer that stack.
Absolutely. All righty, well, let's talk about team structures because I know we're getting close to time here. I'll try not to interrupt.
We'll try to go a little faster then, right? I mean, there's different types of companies besides the size. There's also types of companies. So agencies is our first starting point here. Often data engineering at agencies, and with agency I mean like marketing agencies. So like not generally like consultancies, but rather there's a marketing agency that builds websites or mobile apps or whatever for other companies. If you're a data engineer at an agency, you live in marketing, because unless that agency is insanely huge, they don't have like their own department. So you're part of marketing, and you often have to be that jack of all trades. You often have to do less pipeline tooling here because at an agency the workflows are tend to be more not repetitive, but yeah, I guess a little on the repetitive side, because you build apps, right? So you're thinking of like what do you have to measure and what you have to get out tends to be the same from project to project, or at least similar.
Sure.
Yeah, so I mean, a team structure, yeah, you often don't have a dedicated data team instead of marketing, but you tend to work with other marketers, often the account managers. If things go really bad with the clients, if you're a data engineer at a marketing agency and you have to be on a client call, that's usually when something went really wrong.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, sometimes you work with the developers, just to, if there's things that are beyond your skill set. This tends to also be lots of times the entry level or the entryway into the data engineering world is to help out with the analytics sides of marketing agencies, because it's since it is a standardized workload, you can learn something and repeat it often, and then grow your career from there like onwards.
Yep.
Pros and cons of being at an agency. Lower barrier to entry into this industry, not specifically the industry that the agency is dealing with, but the data industry. When you have to work with the clients in case of something goes horribly wrong, like you learn soft skills because you have to, you can't tell the client, well, this is just a dumb question. It's often frowned upon. And like I said, you have standardized workflows. I put it here as a con because it helps you, refine your skill set. If you don't have to constantly figure out a new problem, you can learn how to be better at solving the same kind of problems. The con is that at a marketing agency, data tends to not make money. You're a cost center, which means you have an issue, vouching for, hey, we need this more, complicated tool, or we need to pay for our data stack. We need to have a warehouse, or we need to have ETL tools, because since data doesn't directly make money, it's hard for the agency to pass that cost on, and it's difficult. And of course, the flip side of not specializing as much means you have a harder time really mastering a specific skill, because you might be doing a little bit of SQL now, but in JavaScript the next day, and so on. Yep. That's agency life. I mean, there's other parts to agency life too, but as far as the data engineering side is concerned,
yeah, absolutely.
This is it. Another thing is you can be a data engineer embedded in teams. So this is not an agency, but rather a company that makes a product or a series of products, and usually on the smaller side, there isn't a dedicated data team, but rather certain teams have a data person on them, especially if they have some sort of like SWOT structure, right? It tends to be like a couple of engineers, a product person, and a data person that kind of round this off. So obviously where you are depends on which of those, like pods you fall into. And depending on these pods, it also changes which of those archetypes you are. Most often, if you work with product or support and success, you have to either be the wrangler or the planner, just because they have very established tools that they work with. And usually for established tools, there's established pipelines, so you don't have to do as much plumbing. It's more of really like using the data. On the marketing side, you have to be with the plumber, because they want to, capture things here and there, or try to activate something in the new different tool or whatever. And you have to just, make it work. In the engineering side, of course, you are the plumber. Sometimes the planner, but most often the plumber.
Yeah, I think marketing's data demands, I think, again, we kind of said earlier, it's the tip of the spear, but just the volume, the complexity, the velocity of testing, it just demands a lot of change, which is good, right? And allows teams to move faster, but it just requires sort of rewiring things over and over again.
Of course, and that's like the agile mindset that you have to have there, right? It's just like you have to build something full well knowing that in a month or two, whatever you've built is now garbage, because either that project is done or the tool isn't being used anymore or whatever. But that's just part of the job there.
Yep.
Right, pros and cons. Obviously, if you're directly embedded in the team that you have to work for, there's a lot less back and forth, because not necessarily right now on account of the state of global things, but you generally sit right next to the people that have the questions for you, so that helps. Which directly translates into you can be more proactive. You don't have to wait until somewhere down the road problem comes up where somebody asks us like, okay, and how are we measuring this, or how are we supporting this tool? And your first question is, what tool, what feature? I've never heard of this. It tends to not happen if you're directly embedded in the team. And of course, you are by nature of that more specialized, because if you're focused on CSM and CRM tooling, you learn the ins and outs of the pitfalls of those tools. On the con side, you could feel like you're on an island, because you are not directly contributing to the same kind of output that the rest of the team is doing. If you're on product, for instance, like the product person works on a feature, the engineers build that feature, and you kind of just do data things around that feature. That it feels a little islandy at times. And it's most often just not an entry-level role. You have a very hard time being entry-level going into data engineering, specifically on a CRM team, because they're looking for very specialized skill sets for that role.
Yeah, and I mean, you're kind of jumping a lot of times into a workflow that, even though it can be established, there's complexity here, right? And so you need to be able to jump in and kind of figure out what's going on and provide value pretty quickly. Yeah,
and that's usually an expectation of those kinds of roles, is that you can provide value very quickly, and that you don't take 3 months to onboard.
Yep.
And of course, it requires some non-data skills, because if you have to work on a specific team that deals with a specific thing, be it the internal product or an external SaaS tool, you need to understand that tool. And if that's something that you don't care about, then being in one of those embedded teams might not be for you.
Sure.
Righty, as its own team. Well, if you're on your own team, you're on your own team. Simple as that. And it really depends. Like, those teams tend to hire, it's still always just listed as either data engineer, data analyst, but you could find out pretty quickly from either the job description or from an interview or just reaching out on LinkedIn what kind of archetype they're looking for, because it's usually very, very obvious. Because by the time an org has its own data team, they don't look for a person that can do 30 different data related things at once. They look for, I need another analyst, just because we have so much more SQL building to do. Yeah. And of course, if you're that hub and spoke system as a data team, you have to work with everybody else in the org, because the whole point of centralizing that is to have that cluster of data people that then can support everyone else.
Yep.
Well, the pros, you get to work with other data people, which means you can learn from them and you can bounce ideas off of them. You can talk through roadblocks and hypotheticals with people that deal with the exact same thing that you're dealing with. That is a huge benefit, which leads to like the best learning opportunities. Also, if you're on the more senior side here, there's still a great learning opportunity because having to explain your own data stack and issues to someone who's like newer to that work, helps you really, annotate and document some things that are second nature to you, but seem very strange to a newcomer.
Yep.
Yeah. And of course, you're specialized. On the con side, it can, if it's not executed well, and that's usually then on the data ops manager side and so forth. Like if you don't set it up right, you're a silo. Data lives off in its own world. You just, you send tickets to the engineers to add things here, or you send, you get tickets in from other teams. It's that's a bad thing if that happens because it, as part of the office politics type of things, like if people don't understand what data is doing and there's no visibility into that, then that affects things like budgets and promotions.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, by definition, you're reactive if you're a team that has to wait for other requests to come. The benefit of being in the embedded team, you know what's going on in the team. If you're the data engineering team, you have to wait and see what's coming in. And of course, you tend to be more on the cost center side. If you're a very, very large org, the data team makes a lot of money for the org. But on the SMB side of things, if you're a data team, you tend to be in the cost center, which has the implications of I need to buy this tool. Well, that costs money. That's in the budget, but it helps me do the job better. It becomes a lot more of a difficult conversation.
Yeah, it is interesting, and we have some time to get to a couple questions here, which will be great. So please raise your hand. I can unmute you or write your questions into the chat. Looks like we already had a question come in. I'll make one comment before we jump into the questions. It is interesting to see this structure at different companies. So we've seen it, some of our customers have talked about structured embedding, where you sort of have sort of centralized management of a data team, but operationally the data engineers will sit on those teams, as opposed to sort of the shared services model where everyone comes and makes requests of sort of a centralized team. And I think both can work really well. I think to your point, Max, it depends on how you run it.
And it's not a binary thing. You're either one structure or the other, right? This can be a fluid thing where, like you said, you can have a centralized data team, but that people aren't embedded in the other teams. But you have this one person that mostly deals with product, and you have this one person that mostly deals with sales. And like so, there is a range there as to how hard you go into one of those two of those things.
Sure. I'm going to read this question. It's a great one from Brian. You showed a trend where going from startup to SMB to enterprise, a company tends to go from many dispersed and varied data engineers throughout the company down to a single dedicated specialized team. We are an SMB with a dedicated data engineering team, but we're also starting our own implementation of the data mesh approach, which tries to decentralize data ownership and data engineering-esque expertise. It seems to go against the trend of your bigger company, more centralized data. What are your thoughts on how data mesh changes the role of plumber, planner, data engineers on their own team? What a great question, Brian.
That is a fantastic
All right, Max.
No, that's absolutely great. And if you have this kind of company, hang on to it for dear life, because that's a great approach to have. One of the reasons that centralized data teams, especially on the enterprise side, tend to exist like that is because other teams, the data consumers, have less technical knowledge. Some of them, might not even understand when you say like, oh yeah, this is an event stream. This captures like event data that has properties in it. Some of them might not understand what that means, which, and because they have their day job and they spend their 40 plus hours a week on specifically what they're doing. So you need to have that centralized team to support those people and have that English to nerd translation. If you can get to like a data mesh or a data democratization approach, that's great. I've seen it rarely either tried or even successfully implemented. But if you have everybody knowing a lot more about the ABCs of data, and maybe even some people that that are not on the data side but have SQL knowledge, like that's great, because the more self-serve these people can do, the overall more efficient like the entire org becomes, because it's just lag time. If you don't have to go out to ask a specialist data person something, or you don't have to wait until a data engineer helps write a script for something, but you can do a little of that yourself, even though you're a salesperson, that's fantastic. Yep. So it's not necessarily that like if you are a large company, you have to have the centralized data teams. That's just because very large companies tend to be a little on the older side as far as they just exist for 20, 30 plus years. That's the natural structure of less data savvy people.
Yep.
Hope that answers the
I think
question.
also, such a good question. I'll just give a quick response here, and please share additional questions if anyone else has some questions. But Brian, I would say I think you're in a really great place as an SMB. I think you can conceptualize of the data mesh approach and sort of embedded data engineers from the beginning. I think as we think about larger companies, there are actually some technical limitations that have led to that team structure. So I think looking back, one of them is, it sounds funny to say this, but it's really not until the last couple of years that it got way, way easier to actually integrate the stack. There's, sort of pipeline tooling that's come of age in the last 5 years has actually enabled new team structures in data engineering. And really, very excitingly, like new ways of building the stack with the data mesh approach, which is really cool. So if you think about a lot of enterprise companies who had pre-existing infrastructure, it's really hard for them to decentralize from literally a technical standpoint. So that's one. The other, I would say, and this again is sort of technical, but also cultural, I would say, inside of a company, is data governance. So the big problem with decentralization that a lot of companies have experienced is that you start to have drift in the quality of your data. And so centralization in order to enforce data governance, and as you become larger, your stack becomes more complex. The needs of downstream teams become more complex. Sort of the reaction can be to centralize in order to force data governance. But again, there's some technology coming out that's really exciting around how to solve that. I know at RudderStack, we're building APIs that allow you to sort of run data governance on all of your pipelines, which is really cool. And that's sort of integrated into your own workflow. And so things like that, I think we'll increasingly see as a foundation for enabling that data mesh approach where people can be embedded without necessarily having the integrations or data governance problems. Really good question.
Exactly to your point, like it's new, relatively speaking, new tech. Warner, for instance, has a system for games that collects data, sends it to a system that then does some transformation and puts it in a standardized schema into a warehouse. Does that sound familiar? As far as a Rudder SDK and Redshift destination look, right? So like they built that themselves from scratch because they have been doing that for a lot longer than things like Segment, Snowflake, Rudder have been around.
Yep. Yeah. Really good question. Well, we're at time here. Really appreciate everyone joining. Feel free to shoot us an email if you have any questions. My email is eric@rudderstack.com. And Max, your email is?
My name is it's Max Werner at obsessiveanalytics.com.
Cool. Thanks again for joining us. We'll follow up with an email with a recording of this, so feel free to share it, and we'll catch you on the next one.
See you then.